Welcome to The Inside Story. I am Billy Hallowell, and today I am joined by Ryan Foley from the Christian Post. We're going to be diving into a variety of very important topics surrounding the 2024 presidential election, mainly Vice President Kamala Harris. She's obviously the Democratic nominee for president this election cycle. Her announcement that Minnesota Democratic Governor Tim Walz was going to be her running mate obviously made a big splash this past week. We're going to be breaking that all down. Ryan, how's it going today?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on. There's a lot to unpack here. I think for most Americans, they didn't know much about Walz. So this was kind of, for a lot of people, a new introduction to somebody. Let's just start with a general overview. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, so he was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Minnesota's 1st Congressional District in 2006. He defeated a Republican incumbent to win the seat. He represented the district in Congress for 12 years. He barely hung on in 2016 because Trump carried the district by double digits, so he opted not to run for re-election. In 2018, instead, launching a gubernatorial bid, he ultimately won the Democratic primary as well as the general election. He beat his Republican opponent by double digits and was reelected by a much smaller margin in 2022. I wouldn't say much smaller, but slightly smaller, like 7.5 points or so. And he's a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is very common in Minnesota.
Okay, so that gives us a little bit of a snapshot of him. An interesting history there with, running for office and the decisions that were made. Obviously there are a lot of elements that the Democrats clearly think are going to benefit them, or they wouldn't have chosen him for this position. How, though, are the Democrats in this country overall reacting generally so far when it comes to Walz?
And for the most part, Democrats are thrilled. You've seen Joe Manchin come out in favor of him. He's definitely one of the more conservative or moderate Democrats in the U.S. Senate. And then Walz has also gotten praise from those on the other side of the ideological spectrum within the party, being the far left. Reverend Al Sharpton, who praised Walz's actions following the death of George Floyd in police custody in 2020, is in favor of Walz. And then, while I have not covered this for the Christian Post, Van Jones, a longtime Democrat political strategist with ties to Obama, reacted to Walz's selection by suggesting that Harris was caving into some of these darker parts in the party by not picking Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. And then his use of the term darker parts in the party refers to what he calls anti-Jewish bigots, noting that Shapiro is Jewish. And then this all occurs in the context of outrage over the conflict in the Middle East. So Van Jones was basically saying she picked Walz because she thought Shapiro would offend people who are like very anti-Israel because of the whole Middle East situation, and she thought Walz would not turn those people off as much.
Yeah, it's interesting because that backdrop, I think a lot of people have sort of scratched their heads a little bit with Walz, thinking Shapiro might have been the better option. And so the factors you just mentioned, there's a lot of speculation around that. And the other factors of some of Walz's policies, which we'll talk a little bit about in a moment, which would be seen as a little bit more far left, calling himself progressive, one person's, socialism's another person's neighborliness, some of these quotes that are making the rounds. It's interesting. He's just an interesting pick. Now, you mentioned some of the Democrats, even on the more conservative side, are generally very positive about his pick. What are Republicans saying?
Well, Republicans are definitely concerned about the prospect of a Harris Walz administration due to the policies that they support and have supported. Conservative activists like Allie Beth Stuckey have specifically expressed alarm about Walz's policies on abortion and LGBT issues as governor. And as Van Jones suggested, Republicans are probably relieved that she didn't pick Shapiro because his popularity in a swing state that is a must win for Democrats could have effectively sealed Pennsylvania for her and possibly the election as well, whereas Walz doesn't necessarily have any particular benefit in a state because she was probably already going to win Minnesota anyway.
Yeah. So, there's a lot obviously there. And I know there's a lot of worry and panic about some of those policies, obviously. There have been some harsh words over Wall's trans policies in particular, the way he's handled the transgender issue, and even a nickname for him that was thrown out there, tampon Tim or whatever, and just a lot of these things that are out there right now. What's the backstory on that? Because it's becoming a bigger issue, I think, especially for social conservatives.
Well, yeah, last year Walz signed into law a bill requiring all public and charter schools in the state that serve students in grades 4 through 12 to make menstrual products available in all restrooms. The bill uses gender neutral language, specifically the term menstruating students, and the phrase all restrooms means that both boys and girls' bathrooms are expected to have menstrual products, even though only girls can menstruate. So, this bill reflects the ideology that gender identity and biological sex do not align all the time, and that trans identified female students who use the boys' bathroom should be able to access the menstrual products as well, even though probably north of 90% of people who use the boys' bathrooms who are actual boys will never use the menstrual products.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people it's a little alarming, and that has created some of, especially for Christians looking at this issue. I think a lot of people are a little alarmed and want to hear more and understand more about some of those policies. Some assumed Harris might choose somebody middle of the road, right? And you mentioned there are some conservatives or more conservative folks in the Democratic Party who have backed his pick as VP, in this instance. But does he fit a middle of the road in your view persona based on some of the policies we've seen, or does he not?
Not really. As I wrote about earlier this week, Walz did receive some positive ratings from conservative and right leaning interest groups early in his career in the House, but he also has very high ratings from progressive influence groups that have the most influence on Democrat politics today. Like he has a 100% rating from NARAL Pro Choice America in 2017 and 97% rating from the Pro LGBT Human Rights Campaign. And while people might point to the fact that he got elected in a district that voted for Trump as evidence that he's more of a centrist, his district actually voted for Obama, so it's not necessarily been an ultra conservative district throughout his whole political career.
So, you've been looking at this a lot, obviously, over the past week. What has been the most surprising thing to you when it comes to Walls that you've uncovered, that you've covered as you've been exploring his background?
Well, his church is very progressive. I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this, but in many cases, as I've covered multiple times for the past several years, progressive and Democrat politicians often find themselves at odds with their churches, particularly if they're Catholics and they openly advocate for legal abortion. At Walz's church, I actually found a sermon where the preacher indicated he had little desire to talk about the subject of the day, specifically Trinity Sunday, instead preferring to talk about gun violence, racial injustice, and climate change.
So yeah, that is interesting, and I think we're going to see more of that you know, as we see churches fall away from biblical truth. You're going to see a lot of people who are able to say, "Look, and I'm not just this isn't just a Walls comment; it's a comment in general. My policies align with my church. My church aligns with my policies." And so I think we're seeing more and more of those churches that are very, very sort of progressive, departing from biblical truth in some ways, aligning more with some politicians in the process. So that's an interesting prospect in a world where, 10, 15 years ago, people would have thought more, oh, well, people are going to just become atheists or move away from faith. Now you have this facet of people who, I think it's growing, are sticking with faith, but they're doing it on their own terms, right? So that's interesting. How do you think the selection of Walls, just as a final question here, has maybe changed the race? Has it been profound? Has it not been? What's your take on the amount that it's changed the race?
There's no evidence that it really has at this time. Some polls show Harris leading, other polls show Trump leading. That hasn't really changed. As I said earlier, Minnesota was probably going to go for Harris anyway. If anything, this will just put it further out of reach for Republicans. But if Shapiro had been chosen, it's possible that her standing would have been improved in Pennsylvania, but it's probably still going to be a very close race with or without Walz on the ticket.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, I appreciate, as always, you coming on and breaking it all down today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Everyone else, make sure you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. We'll see you then.